Everybody, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I have to apologise to begin with. I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm sounding a bit nasal. So if you can't hear, please do speak up at the back. So really, this is the first in the 10-week lecture series, and really this is designed to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some things you might want to consider. Can I just get a show of hands? Who's just starting? Oh, fabulous. You're in the right talk. Always good to know. So if you don't understand something or it's not clear, please feel free to jump in and ask a question. I'll answer brief questions to clarify things during the talk, and otherwise if we could save any longer questions to the end, that would be great. So just a little bit of intro, as we've got so many new faces here, about PRONI. PRONI was established post-partition under the Public Records Act of 1923. We're the official place of deposit for departmental records, so official records, and that's departmental and publicly funded bodies. We also have a remit to take in privately deposited material, and just to give you a bit of a flavour of what that means, we have approximately 3 million records held here in PRONI. Our oldest document dates back to 1219, and it's a papal bull, and it's actually from the Abercorn collection. But the majority of the material we hold dates from sort of the 17th century onwards and into the present day. So that will give you a little bit of a flavour of just the sheer volume. So getting started, I suppose the first thing to think about is gathering information. So key things you want to think about: names of the individuals you want to research, an address, and by address I mean if it's a town or city, particularly if it's a town, most were not too big 100, 150 years ago. You want to get an area or specifically some street names if it's one of the bigger cities. For most people, when they go back a few generations, particularly even if they're city dwelling now, you'll find that lots of ancestors were from more rural areas. So really what you want to look for here is a townland if you can, a parish if not. So just to give you a little flavour, Ireland is divided geographically. A townland is the smallest land division. There are a number of townlands in a parish. Parishes are based on civil parishes, broadly mirror the Church of Ireland parishes. Presbyterian congregations have slightly different boundaries, and Roman Catholic parishes have slightly different boundaries, but they're a slightly bigger denomination. I'll not go into any more details about some of the others, but just to note, to remember that most of the source material you will be consulting was not designed originally for us to consult for family and local history purposes in the future. So most of these sources were designed for a business or an administrative purpose. So you will find that most records and resources are arranged geographically. So this is why it's quite important to get a grip on where your ancestors came from, if possible. You can get away with it if you have a more unusual surname and they occur less frequently, but that's not always possible for many, many researchers. Significant dates, obviously you want to be thinking of dates of birth, dates of marriage, immigration, dates of death. And I suppose these are quite obvious points, but that some people often overlook. Go and speak to family members, particularly if you have older relatives. I've heard so many people say that they thought they knew the family story, but when you actually ask very specific and focused questions to elderly relatives, you actually find that perhaps lots more than you originally thought will come out of those conversations. Things like, one example I know personally is where somebody was tracing their family history and they got back a couple of generations and they knew they attended a particular church, and they were looking in the church records and they couldn't understand why they couldn't find any more information. And the great aunt then sort of casually was earwigging on this conversation and heard, oh, but that's because they fell out with the vicar in that church, and actually they had belonged to such and such parish before that. So It's an example of how sometimes if you don't ask the question or have that conversation with specific questions, you won't necessarily know if you've got all of the detail. Family Bibles are another wonderful resource, particularly if there's a traditional family or ancestral home. You know, poke about in the attic, shoe boxes, newspaper clippings, all of that type of information often turn up and can provide you with a wealth of information to get you started. Look in photograph albums, look for annotations in the back of photographs, and visit your local graveyard and see what kind of graveyard inscriptions you can find. Is anybody else researching? Ask your family members, has anybody from the extended family been in contact? And that could be somebody from overseas, that could be somebody Canada, Australia, America, who's actually done an awful lot of this background research for you. Family and local history societies are a fabulous starting resource. I would just add at this point, the sources I'm talking about are some of the main sources that cover the most people and cover the most area. There are always sources which relate specifically to areas, and family and local history societies and local knowledge are always one of the best ways to gauge what exactly exists in the area that you're researching. So it's a really good point of contact. A check online. With the advent of social media and the web, you'll find lots of discussion forums and blogs. You'll find key hints and tips on what good websites you can look at. Particularly, you may find somebody who's blogging or posting about your particular family. They're fairly straightforward to search. Many of the family and local history societies or independent sites post sources relative to a particular area. Many of them have taken specific records and transcribed things like school registers and church records. And if those exist, get looking for them up front, because they're a fairly straightforward and easy way to start gathering relevant information. Printed material is another good thing to look for, again, in your family and local history societies, in your local library. Does your local library have a research or special collection section? You'll find some periodicals and antiquarian books for the area. I'll not go through them all, but I'll just highlight a couple. Newspapers are a good example. The Belfast Newspaper Library, which is part of Belfast Central Library, is a fantastic resource for accessing historic newspapers. Ordnance Survey Memoirs is another one. The OS Memoirs were compiled alongside the Ordnance Survey maps, and they didn't get to the whole of the country, but they started in Rathlin and worked their way down, so they're actually quite good Ordnance Survey memoirs for the top half of the country before they decided it was proving way too labour and financially expensive. So they'll give little bits of information about the nature of the landscape, what kind of people lived there, what they did, sometimes bits and pieces about immigration. So a really interesting source. So when you've made a start, again, these are some common sense ones, but I'm just throwing them out here. Get yourself organised. So get a folder, either a paper or a plastic one, or if you're internet savvy, get an electronic folder. You wouldn't believe how much work you will start to do and how quickly that will become voluminous once you start actually doing research. So it's good to keep organised and keep a record of what sources you've consulted, be they paper sources or online sources, and quite significantly, make a note of the sources you've looked in, even if you haven't found anything relevant. And that's for a couple of reasons. Most of us lead busy lives, so many of us will dip in and out of research. So it will be quite difficult to remember in maybe a month or 6 months down the line if you've actually looked at that website, consulted that source. And in other circumstances, you may think that's not relevant at the minute, but you may turn up information in the future which actually points to something in that source that you might want to come back to. And again, part of family history is not just names and dates structured on a tree. Part of this is really collating the story. What were those people's lives like? What did they do for a living? Where did they grow up? what was life like in those different eras. So any of that biographical information and photographs that can sort of augment and really bring those stories to life are a fabulous way to really make the most of your family tree and make those individuals come back to life. A few little hints and tips. Spelling, things to watch out for. Variations in spelling. Listed a few variations of the surname McVeigh there, with F's and VIGH's and VEY's, and I've come across many occasions where somebody's been tracing their family history and they've said, oh, those are not my ancestors, my Smith are spelled with a Y and not with an I. Bear in mind that there are a couple of things to bear in mind when you go back maybe 100, 150 years. The level of literacy was not what it is today. Many people couldn't read or write. In addition to that, many of the records which were taken, that information was transcribed by an enumerator. So maybe that person wasn't filling in their own form. That person may not have been able to read or write to verify the spelling of their surname. Your enumerators could have been working across vast swathes of territory. So if you imagine variants of surnames that are peculiar to an area, regional accents, throw all of that into the mix, and it can make for quite interesting searching. So I would never rule out information that looks like it may be correct just because there are errors in the spelling. If everything else is pointing to that and saying that looks accurate, don't rule it out because of spelling issues. Other things to watch out for: repetition, naming of children for fathers and grandfathers. And in that little tree you can see 2 names covering 2, 4, 6, 7 individuals across 3 different generations. So naming the first son after the father, sometimes naming the second son after the mother's father, all of these things are little things to watch out for, and can sometimes be useful if you're trying to identify is that the right family, because again, forenames often carry down through family lines. Particularly if it's an unusual forename, it can be a good way of identifying if you have the right family connection. And I said watch out for reuse of names, and by that I mean, I've mentioned the level of literacy. Another thing to be aware of is that infant mortality was much greater than it is today as well. And a lot of the times that was just, particularly in older generations or people we know today, it just wasn't talked about because it was quite commonplace. So oftentimes you will find a child who died in infancy who was perhaps called James. A few years later another child may be named James after the brother who died young. So again, when you're looking for dates and dates of birth, that's one to watch out for if dates occur a little bit out. And just moving on from dates, another one to be aware of is this rounding up of dates and ages. And again, the census can sometimes be a good example of this. This is an extract from the 1911 census. And you can see here in the middle the ages of the 2 individuals. One's 60 and one's 50. It's not uncommon, you will sometimes get a bit of rounding up and a disproportionate amount of people whose ages end with a 0 or a 5. So that can be for convenience, or oftentimes many of those people were born before civil registration. They didn't have a birth certificate. Some of them were genuinely estimating I'm about 50. So it's one to be aware of, again, when you're using those figures to take you back to a date of birth or a date of marriage, for example. So, where do you start? Lots of people come in and say, oh, my great-great-great-grandfather John Smith, I think, lived in such and such a place around 1830. But they know a name and they know an approximate place and date, but they don't have any corroborating information, so that when you start to look and verify that what you're saying is the right family. So sometimes what's actually better to do is start a generation or 2 back where you have lots of information that you can actually have an idea, okay, well that is the right family because that James had a brother called Michael and a sister called Eliza, so that you can actually use the information you know to make sure that you're in the correct line, that you're looking in the right place, that you have the right family to begin with. And I mentioned in terms of how overwhelming sources can get pretty quickly. Sometimes it's good to actually start with an immediate goal and say, right, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to pick either a particular line of the family that I'm very interested in because they worked in a particular occupation or they had a notable life, or I'm going to say pick my paternal line which traces up my surname. So sometimes it's good to put this into bite-sized chunks and say I'm going to concentrate on that. For example, I'm going to get everything around that, and then I'm going to move on and I'm going to say do the maternal line, and then I'm going to branch out and bring that line forward. If you go back a couple of generations and you're looking across at 8 different family groupings across a multitude of different sources in different geographic areas, it can be quite overwhelming. So as I said, sector it out and start small and build up, and that will also help you build your knowledge and your confidence to branch out wider into your research. Getting started again, a good place to start is the PRONI website. And the way I explain this generally is it's sort of a game of 2 halves. Down the left hand side, this is generally informational material, so you'll get our opening hours. Under research and records, you'll get more information about the types of records PRONI holds. There's a section under here called family history and a section under local history again. Lots of information on getting started and key sources. Under local history there's a good section on geographic boundaries and land divisions. So if you're not clear on that, that's a really good place to go and get some starting information. The other side I would draw your attention to is what I call the searchy side. So under online records, social media, guides and leaflets, e-catalogue, these are things where you can go in and you can either search a database and get through to see an original record, a digitised copy of an original, or you can search an index and find out information, or there's a guide or there's a leaflet. Stephen mentioned earlier our series of talks is obviously happening now. PRONI has a YouTube channel. There are a variety of talks and lectures that have been delivered by both PRONI staff, academic speakers on a variety of topics, local interest, sort of exploring local history, plantation, First World War, so a real variety of topics in there. So again, if you're interested and you want to build up your knowledge about archives and sources and research, and you have a bit of time in your hands, this is a good place to start. I mentioned as well guides and leaflets. On the PRONI website we have a full set of our family tree leaflet series, and those are little bite-sized chunks which tell you a bit more in detail about specific sources, some of which will be covered in the up and coming lecture series, but you'll get a much wider variety of source material in those leaflets. And we've also got online guides, and the one I particularly draw your attention to is the guide to church records. So you can't see the church records themselves on the website, but again, if you know the parish your ancestors worshipped in, and if you know the denomination, or even if you don't, this example is Moira, County Down. You can see the parish is divided by denomination, so you've got Church of Ireland records, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic. You've got a mix. If there's an MIC, it's a microfilm copy held here at PRONI. Some records are still retained in local custody. Again, the guide will refer you to that, so you can see what exists and what the covering dates are, so you can quickly work out if there should be church records available. And it's quite good as well for pointing you in the right direction if you're in the wrong parish. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the divisions can vary from Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and Church of Ireland parishes. So, getting started, some of the key dates. A good one to be aware of to begin with is civil registration, and that's your civil birth, death and marriage certificate, same as you or I would have today. Well, not death certificates obviously. But civil registration commenced in 1864 for all births, deaths and marriages. Protestant marriages were registered from 1845 onwards. And the marriage registers within the Protestant churches are a duplicate of the civil registers, so you're seeing exactly the same thing. The RC registers hold pretty much the same The GRO have made some of their records accessible online through the NI Direct website. What I would do is go into Google and Google GRONI, and it'll take you straight to the right link. So that you can search through birth records which are over 100 years, marriage records over 75, and death records over 50 years old, including First World War death records. And again, we have a talk coming up on First World War ancestors, if that's your period of interest. You can do a free index search, and then they're pay per view to see more details from those records. Again, we mentioned church records. The best way to take your research back a step further prior to civil registration is generally via church records, where you have more chance that you will find similar information in regard to particularly baptisms and marriages. This is a Roman Catholic record from Duneen Parish Church in County Antrim, dated 1886. And it's quite a good example where you've got the names of the parents, where they resided, who the sponsors were, and you've got a nice interesting example where somebody married to Anne O'Reilly and where they came from, and that they were married in America, I think. And it gives you, sometimes you get little snippets of additional information in here. So this is a particularly good one. On other occasions you might find a baptismal record which cites a date and a list of children that were baptised and nothing else. And it's a bit of a lucky dip depending on where your ancestors came from, to be honest. So the majority of church records date from the early to the mid-1800s. A smaller number date back to the late 1700s, and a smaller number again date back to the 1600s. And as I said, some are very straightforward to read. This is somewhere in the middle. It's not the best and it's not the worst. This is a good representative average example. Some of them have lovely handwriting, some of them are absolutely appalling. The majority of what we hold are microfilm copies as well. So just to be aware, this is where the fun of research starts to kick in. Census records are another one of your key sources. 1901 and 1911 census are available on the National Archives of Ireland website. Again, just Google 1901 Census Ireland and it'll take you straight there. The 1901 census is the earliest surviving census which exists for all of Ireland. There were earlier census records taken, but they haven't survived, with the exception of little pockets here and there. And again, if you have a look at our leaflets, there's a little breakdown of what has survived for different areas. There's a little slight inroad in old age pension claims, which PRONI holds here on microfilm, which have extracts from the 1841 and the 1851 census. Basically, the old age pension came in 1908. So and you had to be 70. So the people who were eligible to claim obviously were born pre-civil registration. So what they did was they looked at the 1841 and 1851 census to find evidence that those people were recorded in those census records. So it's a little roundabout way into some of those earlier census records which actually haven't survived. So what you can see on the 1901, and this is just an example from my own family. The head of the household and then everybody else's relationship to the head of the household. So in this case, very generic: wife, mother, brother, son and daughter. What religious denomination, whether they could read or write, what age they were, whether they were male or female, what they did for a living, whether they were married or not. Quite significantly, where they were born. And again, if you think 1901, particularly ancestors around the bigger cities like Belfast and Derry, people were moving from rural areas into urban areas for work reasons oftentimes, and this tends to be the case where people have a couple of generations worth of information then start to get a bit stuck. So sometimes this can shed light that actually, in fact, they were not born in the place where the family resided for the next few generations. They had moved from elsewhere. And it also records whether or not they were literate in the Irish language. The 1911 census is slightly different, and I'm showing you this from my family just to highlight one of the things I mentioned before about spelling. So my surname is spelled Hancock, and I get lots of hits when I search for that under the 1901 census. All of them were recorded with a different spelling in the 1911 census. So when I do the same search, I get one result and it's no relation to me. So a good example of if you think something's amiss, keep searching and do other things to try and uncover. So you get a little bit of additional information in the 1911. You get, not only do you get if the person was married, you get how long they have been married, how many children were born within that marriage, and again how many children have survived. So that can be quite useful. Again, sometimes people think, well, there were 4 in that family, and actually there may have been 6 or 8 children actually born, and you can then go and have a look and see are there baptismal records or are there civil records. So if you're not quite sure the area, or a lot of people, particularly in Belfast, will say, well, my ancestors came from Belfast. It's less problematic in more rural areas because you have fewer churches within the parish, and particularly if you know what denomination you're looking for, you've maybe only got a few church records, say, to look through. There are over 120 different parish churches in Belfast, so it's quite difficult to know where to start. So the street directories can be a really good inroad to searching for an ancestor. So we've got 29 directories available to search for free on the PRONI website, around 20,000 pages. They're Belfast and Province of Ulster, so you will get a little bit of information about provincial towns. Names listed for provincial towns tends to be the great and the good, the gentry, and people who had prominent positions like school teachers, justice of the peace, etc. And not so much the actual residents of those local areas. But the Belfast directories are very good in terms of listing people. They include an A to Z by street, and they also include an A to Z alphabetically by person. So if, for example, you know that your John Rankin was a hat maker, you can search for Rankin hat maker, and there might be 20 Rankins, and you might only have 3 which were hat makers, which may allow you to narrow down your search a little bit. Here's an example. We've got our first Prime Minister James Craig listed in one of our directories, and you can see it highlights your search criteria. So there's an awful lot of information in here, and again, things to watch out for. It's a really good social history because you can see how occupations have changed. So I said if somebody was a hat maker, you also need to look under things like milliner, and you need to think about what those occupations may have been termed at the time. So you could be searching cooper, for example. So it's searching exactly on the word. So it's indexed every word in the directory. So bear in mind, if you search for cooper, for example, it will bring you references to Cooper Street, the surname Cooper, and somebody whose occupation was a cooper. So again, just think how you're searching that. But it's a really good resource. If you're tracing, particularly, well, across both urban and rural, valuation records are a good starting point. I mentioned that we don't have any earlier census records prior to 1901. The Griffiths valuation is largely regarded as a mid-century census substitute. And Griffiths valuation was a land valuation taken between 1848 and 1864. And those date variants are basically they started at one end and worked their way through. So depending on the area, that will be the date in which the census was taken in your particular parish. So Griffiths valuation lists heads of household only. And it was actually it's arranged by poor law union because it was actually taken to establish or used to establish how much people should pay towards the upkeep of the poor in their area. So the Griffiths valuation, they're printed sources available to search for free on the Ask About Ireland website. So you can search by name or you can search by place. And I've just in at the back you'll see not only do they give you this printed reference, so you can search for a name and then they're organised by townland and a list of the householders within that townland. And what you'll also see down this column is a map reference. So there's a specific plot listed You can go into the maps on the website, and you can go in, you'll see it. I know it's difficult to see here, but there's a little slider bar, and it can take you from a Google map across and back to the valuation record, which has been overlaid, the valuation map. So depending on what you know, if you know the area now, you can go into the Google map and refine it down by Google, and then you can pull this little slider bar and the Griffiths valuation map will appear over the top of it, and you can see here all of the plot numbers are overlaid. So it depends what you know. If you know the person, you can search by name. Equally, some people will know where the family home was, but they won't necessarily know who lived there in the mid-1800s. So again, you can go by place and work out the plot number and go back in the opposite direction, if that makes sense. If you want to take that search forward, PRONI holds the valuation revision books. So there was an annual revision, and there's a volume will cover a number of years. So PRONI has digitised the valuation revision books. So I should just say the Griffiths on Ask About Ireland, the searchable database covers all of Ireland. PRONI's valuation revision book database covers the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. Valuation revision books exist for the south of Ireland, and they're held in the National Archives of Ireland. So our revision books cover the period 1864 to 1933, and then we have valuation revision books that go on up until the 1970s on site in PRONI. So what you can see here is, and it's not a great scan, but I don't know if you can see, there's a list of the householders, and there's little pen annotations in different colours. So each year when a property would change householder or ownership, that will be scored out, and in a different coloured pen the new head of household will be placed in, and on the far side you usually get the exact date when that happened. And they're different colours because this volume covers a number of different revisions over a period of time, maybe 6 to 8 years. So this is a really, really good way of tracing heads of household in a particular property from basically Griffiths in the mid-1800s right up until the 1930s. And you can make an educated guess at why that might be. Sometimes that's because somebody is elderly and has passed that property on to a younger relative. Sometimes that person has died, and it might give you an indication that you should go and look for a death register or a will. Very occasionally, and I mean very occasionally, but somebody we know here in PRONI has actually found a reference to say that a person immigrated listed on the valuation revision books, but very unusual to get that level of detail. Prior to Griffiths, there are a number of other what we would class as census substitutes, and basically you're getting to the point now where they list heads of household in a particular area, so no more detail on the family within. So tithe allotment records, they predate Griffiths slightly, so they were compiled between 1823 and 1837, and basically the tithe was a revenue collection for the upkeep of the established church, which at the time was the Church of Ireland. The National Archives of Ireland have digitised and have a free search available for the tithe allotment books covering the parishes in the Republic. The Northern Ireland parishes are available here on microfilm at PRONI. And again, heads of household. You can also have a look, PRONI's name search application covers a number of earlier records, such as 1740 Protestant householders and a couple of religious census, which don't only list Protestant people, they also list other denominations within those census records. I'll just draw your attention, you can also search early coroners records on this application, and if that's of interest, our talk on the 6th of May covers coroners records. And also you can search pre-1858 wills. So pre-1858 wills, the majority were lost in the fire of the Four Courts in Dublin, which was the Public Record Office of Ireland. Odd ones appear in random places, particularly things like solicitors' records and in private papers. So the pre-1858 search on PRONI name search will tell you if there's an original record which exists, or some of the data in that searchable index has been taken from diocesan will indexes, and basically the index to say a will was made has survived, but the will itself has not. So the record that you find in name search will tell you whether or not there is something more to see. And this is an example of a pre-1858 will. I'll just read it out for anybody who can't see. This is copy will of Moses Whiteside of Mullabrack, County Armagh, bequeathing to his wife the bed, the cow, the household furniture and a third of his farm. To son George the oak slider loom and 1 and 1pence. To his daughters Margaret Stewart, Mary Kerr, Elizabeth Hull and Agnes Truff, he leaves 1 and 1pence. And to his grandson William Truff, he leaves £2, 5 shillings and 6pence. So not only does that give you a fantastic social history, so he's making sure his wife has her bed to sleep in. Obviously his son is getting the farm and the oak slider loom, so that tells you a little bit of what kind of economy that they were engaged in. And again, what was important here, the daughters have all been married off and are now somebody else's responsibility to look after, but you can see who they married. So there's another 4 in-routes into 4 different families, and also his grandson William. So if you were researching William Truff with a mother Agnes, you'd be onto a pretty good opening up of some family connections here. Post 1858 wills, again on the PRONI website on our will calendar search. We have the searchable database covers the period 1858 to 1965. We have images of the copy will books up to approximately 1900, and then from 1900 onwards the majority of those are will calendar entries. And just to give you an example of those, this is a copy from the calendar entry which states that there's a will of Thomas Andrews, who we're all aware of from Titanic connection, but that is 1912, so we don't have an image for that, but the will is available. You can come into PRONI and order it. This is the will of Charles Lanyon, an earlier will, and obviously very well-known architect. So this gives you an idea of the range of information available, and you can click in and see the copy of that will. Some of the more generic sources just to touch on that are worth remembering and consulting. School records. We have, I don't have an exact figure, we have approximately 1700 schools which we have records for, with registers dating from 1860s onwards. And they're a really useful source again for identifying children in a particular place. What they often do, Belfast is a good example of some of the schools at the turn of the century, because it will tell you where the child previously attended school or where they were coming from. So again, it's another one of those sources which can give you a little bit of information to tell you or to suggest that maybe those people moved to a place from a different area. Board of Guardian Records is another really useful source. So there were 27 unions or workhouses in present-day Northern Ireland. I suppose a lot of us think about the workhouse as this Victorian Oliver Twist type institution for only the very destitute. In actual fact, the workhouse was in operation in Northern Ireland up until the 1950s, sort of early 1950s, when it was replaced by the welfare state. And particularly in the 20th century, it had really become in lieu of sort of a hospital, social welfare. So people went into the workhouse not only because they were destitute, but with fairly, what we would class as fairly minor things now. So if you broke your leg and you couldn't work, there was no sick pay, there was no unemployment benefit. If a woman had 6 children, her husband was injured and couldn't work, and she couldn't work because she was nursing a child, then there really was very little other option. So I suppose it has been stigmatised for a while, but in actual fact, thousands of people passed through the workhouse system. They're not great scans, but the Indoor Relief Register will name who the entrant was, what age they were, whether they were married or single, what their employment was, what their address was, and what why they were admitted into the workhouse. And this is a really interesting example of an outdoor relief register, and it lists the name of an outdoor relief was paid to people who had a very small holdings, and it was paid in situ, so they weren't admitted into the workhouse. So you've got a guy called James Faluna, he's aged 99. Cicely Faluna, who it tells us is his wife, and was aged 95. So again, this kind of gives you an idea. This was really a precursor to social welfare in many cases. So our Board of Guardian Records are subject, the registers are subject to 100-year closure, because obviously there's a lot of personal data around things like illness, mental health, illegitimacy of children. So the earlier registers are open. Anything that's less than 100 years old, or if there's anything in the register which is less than 100 years old, is currently closed. But if you're looking for somebody in the Board of Guardian record, you can put the information you have down and write into PRONI, and we will undertake that search for you, consult with the relevant department, and the specific information that relates to your family will be released, but not everybody else's. PRONI has a wealth of material from a variety of landed estates. We looked at Valuation Records earlier. The thing to bear in mind that prior to 1900, most farmers were tenant farmers. So before the breakup of the landed estates around the turn of the 1900s, most people who were farmers were tenant farmers, and that those swathes of land were part of a large landed estate. In landed estate, so this tends to be a little bit more involved in terms of research, and not as easy as just putting something into a database and seeing what comes back. However, you can find really rich information, things like leases, rent rolls, lists of tenants, and maps. And here we have a list of tenants and what they paid. We have a beautiful estate map which breaks down each townland and plot who was living in each of those individual farms. I mentioned burial and gravestones earlier, so excuse the text, I'm just going to whiz through this. So there Ulster Historical Foundation undertook a History from Headstones project, which resulted in over 50,000 inscriptions from over 800 graveyards being indexed. Those are available on a pay-per-view basis through Ancestry Ireland. Belfast City Council have also undertaken a huge project whereby about 360,000 records from Belfast City Cemetery, Roselawn and Dundonald cemeteries are available to search on the Belfast City Council website. If anybody's interested in Emigration Records, the website, again, if you Google DIPPAM, D-I-P-P-A-M, the Irish Immigration Database is available on that resource, free to search, holds in excess of 33,000 documents which relate to immigration, and that can be things like letters, advertisements from newspapers, official reports surrounding immigration. And this is an example of something from the PRONI, an immigrant letter from the PRONI archive. And it's what's called a crossed letter. And this was to do with the cost of postage. So you would write normally, and then you would flip your paper round and you would write across the other way. And I've seen instances where it was then flipped diagonally and written crossways. So quite a detective work to be able to actually decipher that. But again, this was the cost of postage, and to keep this down. Immigrant letters are a fantastic resource, not only about life in the new world, but on many occasions they talk about what you would talk about with your relatives on the phone nowadays. How's Auntie Maggie? What are you doing for work? What's the prices for livestock in the local market? You find a wealth of information about Ireland and home in the immigrant letters that go back and forth, because really they were keeping that connection with their home country. So there are quite a lot of options for immigration records. Find My Past in association with the National Archives in Kew, who hold the official passenger lists. have digitised or have indexed 164,000 passenger list records from 35 ports across the British Isles, which includes some Irish ports, between 1890 and 1960. So you can search the index for free, and then they're paid per view. Roots Web have also got free Irish immigration lists extracted from the Ordnance Survey memoirs, which I mentioned earlier. So they're specific to counties Londonderry and Antrim, but they cover an earlier period, 1833 to 39. On many occasions you have a better chance of finding the individual on the port of arrival. So over 20 million immigrants arrived at Ellis Island, and by the mid-century, sort of 2/3 to 3/4 of those immigrants were coming in through New York. So there are a couple of websites, ellisisland.org and castlegarden.org, which give details of those records. And Ancestry, the subscription site Ancestry.com, also have immigration records and indexes covering literally millions of incoming immigrants across Boston, Philadelphia and New York. So just to wrap up on a few that I haven't really touched on, back to the PRONI website again and back to some of the searchable databases. One I didn't mention, we have digitised the Ulster Covenant. Now obviously this largely represents one side of the community. However, there are almost 500,000 names between the Covenant entries and the corresponding Women's Declaration, so it does include an awful lot of people from Northern Ireland. So you can search and then you can click and see the original signatures on the Covenant. We have Freeholders Records, which were linked to basically people's right to vote. Again, those are searchable and you can search through a transcribed, scans. And the e-catalogue, I'll just touch on very briefly, but our electronic catalogue, the 3 million records I mentioned at the start of the presentation, not all of them, but a significant volume are listed in our electronic catalogue. The easiest analogy I would make for this is it's a bit like Argos. Everything we hold has a unique reference number, and it has a title, and it has a description which tells you a little bit about that record. So it doesn't give you all of the information that's held within that record. So for example, it would say that there's a baptismal record of a church. It won't tell you all of the names of the people who are listed within that, but it tells you what's there. So you can't see the original records, but what you can do at home is you can go away and search in the electronic catalogue. You can see if there's any relevant material. You can make notes of those references, so when you visit PRONI, you can come armed with a list of potential references and you can kick off your research really quickly. And this is a nice example for a search under atomic and war, and it's talking about the potential of Cold War in the 1950s, and emergency bread rationing, and how if there's an atomic strike they're going to ensure that bread continues to be delivered across Northern Ireland. So you get all manner of really quirky stuff, as well as the more well-known material. So yeah, have a look in the electronic catalogue. Another hints and tips I would suggest: by all means you can search for the names of individuals, but as I said earlier, lots of things are arranged geographically, so sometimes it's a good idea to put in the townland or the parish where your ancestors lived and see what type of records spring up, and just have a browse through and see what appears. You might find something that you weren't even looking for in there. And just to round off, a picture tells 1,000 words. We have digitised a vast amount of some of our big photographic collections and various little bits and pieces of photographic material from the archives. They're available on our photo stream on Flickr. And we've got lots of nice things like portraits. Cooper, for example, was a photographer working in the northwest. He was based in Strabane, so he covered basically Derry, Tyrone, Donegal area. We have photos from the Allison collection. Again, Allison, a professional photographer based in Armagh, so again covers that down in Antrim connection. And just various other bits and pieces, including national school photographs, the hog photographs of Belfast in and around 1910. So worth a little browse through. And that's me done.